September, poisoned wine. I remember willow vines, and this is my design.
It's pouring down again. It's pouring down again. I'm very below. Weeping willow. It's hard to swallow.
Ice so cold, lost her spell. Underground, close to hell. 11 rings of fire spin, finding heaven inside her skin.
And it's pouring down again. It's pouring down again. It's pouring down again. It's pouring down again. I'm very below. Weeping willow. It's hard to swallow.
It's violent delights and violence
Take yourself out of the grave.
It's violent delights and violence ends. It's violent delights
Take
and
yourself
violence
out
ends.
of the grave.
It's violent delights and violence ends.
In this episode, we're looking at Weeping Willow, which is one of the tracks off Khailana and my EP, Twisted Roots, that came out quite a long time ago. And I thought this session would be really useful to go through because a lot of the effects and routing and plugins that have been used in this session, I think a lot more people will have access to. And, you know, a lot of people using Logic might not have the capacity to think about a billion things, saturation and tape machines and all that, and different compressors and EQs and buses and routing. So I thought this one would be a nice, more simple and effective session to run through. Also, the fact that I'd say the majority of this was recorded at home with an interface with 2 inputs. The only exception being the drums, which were a Glenn Johns setup, which is typical of like the Led Zeppelin era, and only requires four mics. You can do more, and we've done more, which we'll get into later. But yeah, so essentially this is a much more like approachable session and a much more realistic outcome for home producers. But yeah, getting into it, straight away the first thing to talk about is some simple rain and thunder samples. Now, there's an awesome website which I'll put in the description called Free Sound, and it's basically an online community where you can upload recordings that you've made, and other people do the same, and most of it is royalty free, so you don't need permission to use it in your recordings, which is ideal. And that's where these two came from. So definitely check that out. It's an amazing resource. And yeah, alongside the environmental samples in the beginning of the song here, we have a 12-string guitar come in. So that's strumming away on a minor and an augmented chord, if anyone gives a shit. But the mics used were 451 pencil condensers over the shoulders. So up like this, if you can see that. And yeah, being pencil condensers, they don't pick up much body of the guitar, which I knew would be ideal in this track because they were just a consistent supporting role throughout the entire thing, and I knew there'd be a lot of low-end elements in there. So, you know, didn't really need the guitar body. It's a really cool technique. You can hear this one, which would have been on the right side, gets a bit more of the guitar body out of the sound hole, coming over the right shoulder there. And then this one gets all those jangly, jingly harmonics around the fingerboard, which, you know, real important for a 12-string guitar because there's shitloads going on in the left hand, which adds to the sound. Yeah, so throughout the whole track, that's the setup for the 12-string guitars, all the way through to the end where they're strumming away. And yeah, so processing wise, this guy's running into a channel EQ, which is doing nothing apparently. Wise choice. And then the API compressor, which is really great. And looks like it's a relatively slow attack, slow release. Not to kill too much of the transients, I suppose, would be the idea. Interestingly about this plugin is it has a link parameter, which I would usually use for something like this, because, you know, you've got two microphones on the same source, and usually I would link them together so the compression or the detector of the compression is thinking about both at the same time. So if one gets quite loud, it'll pull both down evenly instead of being mismatched. However, I didn't do that for this one because I thought it was a bit more exciting to have a bit of differentiation between the two sources, even though it was on the same performance. And through my interface, there was a bit of opto compression, which was linked. So they were kind of glued together, but I didn't want to overly normalize them. So, to keep kind of some stereo excitement. You may be able to hear the difference if I do it here. It's quite subtle.
I remember willow vines.
Yeah, small difference, but all these small differences add up in the end and make a big difference to the overall sound. And yeah, a little bit of plate reverb on there. Cool. Alright, so I've left myself some markers because it's been so long since I looked at this session. So on the vocals here, we've got two microphones. And these are a NT1000, which is basically a large diaphragm condenser, and a Copperphone, which is made out of telephone circuitry, the old handheld telephones, not like iPhones or anything like that. And yeah, they have a very lo-fi distinct sound. Just get rid of the effects for now, because spoilers. So yeah, I'll play you the NT1000 first.
Late September, poisoned wine.
Cool, lots of low end, obviously. Lots of detail as well. And then the Copperphone.
Late September, poisoned wine.
Ridiculously different. And the reason I used both of these was because when summed together, they create a real interesting, clean and detailed, modern, but also kind of vintage sound. Also, the Copperphone is going out to an octave up pitch shifter with some delay on it. And because the Copperphone is so lo-fi, the signal received by the pitch shifter is already compromised, so it struggles quite a lot to pitch it up and then delay it, creating this really odd granular sound. And maybe I solo that all on its own. And basically the idea was to make it sound like a bunch of ghosty, gremlin-y vocals in the background to suit the kind of the murder ballad subject of the song.
Late September, poisoned wine.
So yeah, you can hear that while the vocals are going, it's absolutely not getting in the way because we're not processing the big, fat, detailed condenser mic, we're processing the Copperphone, and it's only when that space opens up that you can hear those effects pop through, which is awesome. Riff guitars. So, had two sets of riff guitars, or supporting guitars. Had these ones. Now, this was kind of to simulate a 12 string without having a 12 string and to have it spread out across both ears. We have the lower octave of the A flat minor and the augmented chord. And then a capo on the 12th fret to bring it up an octave to create the 12 string effect, pan the opposite direction. And you can probably see these done with a 57 and a Copperphone on the guitars. The Copperphone being a room mic, which is receiving some verb, and then the 57, which is untreated. So similar concept to the vocals. Yeah, kind of having a processed mic that has some character on it, and a mic that captures the attack and is completely unprocessed. So your ear hears both the sonic fuckery and the attack in clarity. So yeah, it's a good benefit of multi-miking, and yeah, still only exhausting 2 inputs. So definitely something everyone could do if they can get their hands on a couple of microphones. Right, so later on in the track, might just let some of it play through so you're not listening to me the entire time.
Late September, poisoned wine. I remember willow vines, and this is my design.
It's pouring down again.
Cool. So what's going on there is on top of Khailana singing her lines, I am whispering.
And it's pouring down again.
Basically sound like an angsty Death Eater. But it's kind of something that's been done quite a lot in the past. Riders on the Storm is an obvious and awesome example. And if you haven't realized there's whispering in Riders on the Storm, it'll change the way you listen to it forever.
It's pouring down again.
So yeah, really just adding a texture there. And it's occupying all, those high frequencies. And yeah, so further using the Copperphone as a secondary mic, it's been drenched in delay for these sections of Khailana's vocals, while, as you can see here, the NT1000, the condenser, is left relatively dry. And instead of, having these in here the whole time for the whole performance, they're just on certain words. So it's like, instead of automating in a delay throw, which is nitty gritty and time consuming, you have your second mic set up with an interesting effect, and then you just literally chuck that in, and it's like, yeah. And of course, like, what I'm using is the stock Logic delay, which has absolutely no character at all. So it's only taking on the character of the microphone.
It's pouring down again.
Yeah, it sounds like a tape delay, like a legit tape delay that's getting uglier and uglier with each pass, which, is all thanks to the microphone. So yeah, can't say about multi-micing vocals how useful it is to have a character microphone and a detailed microphone, whatever that is. We've got a combination of lead vocals and harmonies, still all using the double mic technique. So we've got main vocals, harmony 1, harmony 2. So if I play this section,
I'm buried below. Weeping willow.
so the harmony vocals on the condensers we have a chorus, and on the Copperphones we have a tremolo. This is just to give it some synth pad-like movement. They're roughly the same rate. I like 6 Hz, but you can use anything you want. You can also line it up to the grid with a lot of plugins, so it's the rate at which these things move is to your tempo. And yeah, it's just case by case basis, there's no rules. And yeah, after that, they are also being panned. So if I solo out these chorus vocals,
Weeping Willow.
yeah, you can hear that the first ones are starting center and moving out wide, and that follows the slow legato phrasing of the harmony as well. Whereas the second one pans out and starting center and then kind of chunkily moving out to the wider parts of the stereo image. Just like in the melody, it's more staccato based. So I thought you don't have to do this, but I just thought it would be cool to follow the melodic structure with the panning. You know, kind of reinforcing the musical idea with the stereo image. Cool. And of course, later in the song, in the other choruses, we have the same idea, but extended with many, 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 many more harmonies. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4 harmonies this time, using the double mic and all the tremolo in choruses. So let's have a listen to that.
Weeping Willow.
So yeah, very easily could have started the first chorus with that many harmonies, but then, you know, between here and here, like where would you go? And this one's a surprise when it first comes along, and then this one's a surprise because you hear it again, but it's like way more intense. So when tracking harmonies, I find it's good to kind of use them as like a spectrum. So like start off minimal and then get maximal, or the opposite, or just whatever the song calls for. Yeah. And yeah, again, they're following the legato and then the staccato with the panning automation. Cool. So what have we got next? Reverse vocal effects in the verse. It's definitely one of my favorite parts of the song.
Ice so cold, lost her spell underground, close to hell. 11 rings of fire spin, finding heaven.
Cool. So you can probably hear there's some fuckery going on with the vocals, which is these down here. So this is Khailana, and what we've done is got her to sing a melody over the verse but backwards. So it's been reversed. Got the same setup with a clean condenser affected Copperphone. And then we've got a version of the exact same take, so these would have just been duplicated, and these have been pitched down. So you've got 2 octaves of this long reverse legato phrase going on. if you were listening, you probably heard the panning as well. So they're panning in opposite directions, swimming around like strange vocal jellyfish. And yeah, I thought it was a really creepy, ghostly atmosphere to add in there, and it's super easy to do. Um, yeah, and yeah, it just adds to the whole vibe of that verse, I think. Um, and yeah, speaking more on the harmonies, during the pre-chorus, we have a giant build-up in harmonies, much like before um, with the chorus, but with this line here.
And it's pouring down again.
Cool. So first line, just the vocal on its own with the one mic, and then might be a bit confusing, but this is a chunk of Copperphone with the delay. And then you see it happens here with harmonies, and then here with the harmonies and the Copperphone. And in this bar, you're getting even more harmonies and even more Copperphone. And then finally, you're getting the maximum amount of harmonies with all the Copperphone at the end. So these harmonies are slowly stacking, and if I remember correctly, they're probably getting progressively wider as well. So those are the two parameters you're kind of playing with throughout time, is stacking these harmonies up, but also the width of these harmonies is increasing over time. Because they all need their own space to be heard, but also because, you know, it kind of creates excitement across the pre-chorus to hear it getting wider and wider. So I might play that through for you guys.
It's pouring down again. It's pouring down again. It's pouring down again.
And yeah, how we did these was literally painstakingly with a piano and just testing out different harmonies and how they'd clash with the chords, and copious amounts of wine also. Yeah, so I should probably talk a bit more about the guitars because there's some cool weird stuff going on, especially later in the track. I should probably also mention these things on the left here are folders, which you can create in Logic, which really help with workflow. They can pull down a 71 track session to something like this, which is just way more manageable, and then you can expand them. You do that by clicking multiple tracks you want to be in the same folder, right clicking and creating a track stack in which you can name, and yeah, it's really useful. It doesn't change anything to do with the routing or buses, but yeah, it's just super manageable. Another thing which I haven't done in this session, which I would usually do, is due to the fact these bass things are being sent out to one bus, I would actually right click the bus and create those as tracks as well. That way you don't have to flip between your mixer window and your arrangement window that often. I just find that very useful. Also, if then you wanted to automate something over the entire bass bus, the collection of all the mics, you can do so. So you can automate any parameter on your bus, which would then in turn affect every single microphone. So that could be done with all the vocals, for example, pulling up your vocals, finding your vocal bus, and then boom, press A for automation, and then I could edit the mix of all the vocals reverb send across the entire track instead of doing that individually. And yeah, It's also very useful for compression and tape effects and things like that later down the line. But yeah. So yeah, getting onto the guitars later on, there were some interesting guitars at the end, which, if I remember, were put through a B9, which is a... Yeah, so at the end here, we've got electric guitar going through a B9 pedal, which is a pedal by electro harmonics, which turns your guitar into an organ. So you've got this heavily distorted and organy sounding thing that comes at the end there. Alrighty. See if I missed anything. Not really, we're getting towards the end there. So, I've got some pan call and response at the end there, which, you know, for most people is a pretty easy thing. It's just creative panning. So, Khailana will say a line, I'll say a line, and instead of both occupying the same space in the middle and switching out, because there's some overlap in our singing, we've got, like, you know, I'm slightly one direction and Khailana slightly the other direction, which you can hear here.
It's violent delights and violence.
Take us out, follow the grave.
It's violent delights and violence.
So yeah, a lot more useful than having them all dead center. A lot more exciting. It sounds more dramatic. Yeah, and we like dramatic. Cool. I realize I haven't spoken about the bass at all. The bass, I'm going to be honest, wasn't recorded well. It was recorded at home, lines straight in, no DI, and I think, I can't remember which mic was on the cab, maybe a MD421, the one that always falls off its fucking clip. And yeah, so got a noisy line in. Yeah, very woofy, very unique kind of bass sound that kind of makes it sound like an upright, almost like an electric upright. Which I kind of like, but in hindsight I would definitely have used a DI. Of course this was done at home, and yeah, as you can see, there's not a lot of processing on them, in terms of, it's a bit of tape machine, and a bit of compression, but it's not really, you know, it's not necessary. You don't need all these things on here to get a great sound out of a bass. If you get a good DI sound, which I did not, you can, you know, you're starting with a good foundation. But I should probably note there's chorus on there, which is extremely wide and kind of just fills out the space. And there's a touch of delay as well. So and that delay there is, you know, working from 650 Hertz upwards, so you're not getting a washy, muddy delay, but it's focusing on, you know, the finger sound and the attack of the notes. But yeah, I guess the final thing to get onto for this track would be the drums. As I mentioned earlier, these are Glyn Johns. Yeah, if there's plenty of videos on YouTube on how to achieve this drum setup, and I've done something different where I set up a normal Glyn Johns with 4 mics. So this would be a typical Glyn Johns sound. roomy Led Zeppelin-y sound. On the kick we've got Sub Freak. D12, D112, sorry. And yeah, so one is supplying the low frequency sub, and the other is the more attack kind of vibe. And what I would do these days is I would meticulously go into each one of these. I would chop them all out, do the fades, and yeah, make sure there was no noise in between any of this. You can see I've used a noise gate, but I really can't stress enough how important it is to edit things a bit more accurately than that. Yeah, it's well worth the time, especially if someone's paying you to do recordings for them. But yeah, typically with the Glyn Johns, you would probably use a kick drum mic, the two Glyn Johns, which are specially placed overheads, and then you'd probably use a snare mic as well. But in this case, I decided to opt for two kick mics and the Glyn Johns. But alongside, in parallel, on the same performance, I used two Copperphones, which were kind of featuring throughout this track. So let's hear what that sounds like. No surprises there, sounds like shit. Yeah, so without the Copperphones, the drums sound like this. Huge, meaty, lots of room sound. And yeah, it seems like the Copperphones are only in there a touch, you know. Copperphones are kind of like chili or pepper. You don't want to like cover your food in it, but having it in there a little bit for feature parts is really useful and really fun. Seems here I've summed both my kicks together with a Logic preset, you know, no shame in that. And then the rest of the mics are being summed to an EQ, a compressor, and a plate. I would have done this very differently. I would have perhaps used some tape in between. I would have definitely used a different compressor with maybe some stereo capability. But hey, it kind of sounds good, and this was my first time ever doing Glyn Johns, and you can kind of hear I've got quite a lopsided drum sound. I hear a shitload of kick coming out the left side, you know, and that's fine. It actually works really well in the arrangement because the bass is hogging all the low end in the center anyway, so didn't have to do any side chaining, which was great.
It's violent delights and violence.
So you got bass in the middle, synth guitar on the right, and the kick in the left. This shit used to be done all the time back in the day, so yeah, no shame in that. You definitely don't have to have everything lined up in the middle. Yeah, cool. So there's probably one other thing I should talk about, which I reminded myself of, which was side chaining. The only side chaining I've done in this track is it's on the guitars. So the guitars all get summed to this bus 6, and bus 6 has a side chain on it. Now, the different thing here is this is a multi-band side chain. So, you know, usually, well, I guess traditionally with side chain, you would side chain away the entire volume of the track or bus. Whereas with multi-band sidechain, you can pick a certain frequency band. So here I've got bus 2 feeding into this bus, which you might have guessed is actually the vocal bus. So the vocals are actually influencing the sidechain on the guitars. And they're doing that between 1 and 6K because that's where all the detail of the vocals is. And that's where a lot of the guitar frequencies pile up, particularly with the Copperphone. So yeah, they're kind of sharing that space a lot better with this.
Lights of violence and these violent delights of violence and
So yeah, every time you sing, it's just slightly pushing that out of the way. And yeah, so you could do this on drums, for example, as well. But you'd probably do it down to the low end where they're sharing space. And there's probably various creative applications for this you could use as well. But yeah, a lot better than generic sidechaining, just pulling down the whole volume of the track, because, you know, they're not fighting for frequencies in other areas. You just kind of want to hone in what you need to chop out. And yeah, I guess that'll basically do it for today. There's probably a lot more in here, but this video is probably already ridiculously long. In the future, I'm hoping to maybe do another song from Twisted Roots. Pretty keen to do an androgynous lemon track, which would kind of cover full band recording with isolation booths and a shit ton of mics on the drums, and a lot of synths. And that'll be a good time if we can get into that. But yeah, cool. Stay tuned and stay safe, everyone. I hope you guys aren't too fucking bored. I know I am. Cheers.